So welcome everyone. In order for me to gauge maybe how much of an introduction I should give you, would you like to fill out the quick poll that I wrote? And I think it should be popping up on your screens. We have 4 of 34 people voted. Please take 5 seconds to just fill out that poll. That would be amazing.
Does everyone?
Right.
I don't see it.
I can't.
You don't have the poll?
I don't see it.
Sometimes it doesn't. For some people, it doesn't show on, like, I think maybe on Linux it doesn't show. But so the first question is, maybe we can do it via hand waving as well. In addition, and so for everyone for whom it is the first Foresight Salon, raise your hand now. Raise your hand if you've never been to a Foresight Salon, if you have your video on. Okay, I see at least a few hands. All right, then where are you located? Are you located in North America? Raise your hand. Okay, that's a few. Are you located in Europe, anyone? Feel free to raise your hand. Okay, we have a few Europeans here and a few virtual and a few video hand raises. This is awesome. Is anyone located in Asia? Please raise your hand. And we have a few here as well. Anyone in Africa? All right, no one in Africa. All right. Australia, anyone? And South America. All right, we need to work on our continent diversity here. Then, okay, we also have this meter of like, how are you feeling right now? And it goes from 1 very negative to 5 very, very positive. And so who's feeling 1 very negative right now? Raise your hand. You can out yourself though. Okay, who's feeling like pretty negative, not quite as bad? Who's feeling neutral, quite okay? Yeah, okay, we have a few takers for that. Who's feeling quite positive and very positive? Who's very, very positive? Anders, raise your hand. Yeah, I was about to say. All right, and Krian, of course, you'd go for that too. All right, well, with that, I'm going to end the poll. And yeah, even on the online poll, we have most people in the quite positive camp. All right. So with that being said, I know that for a few of you, it is actually your first Foresight Salon. So what I'm going to do now is say maybe a few words just about what those salons are for. Basically, the Foresight, I'm Allison Duettmann from Foresight Institute. I'm a researcher and I'm the incoming president of the Institute. And Foresight is a nonprofit that has been around for like 30 plus years to advance technologies for beneficial futures. And we have recently started this twice-a-day online salon, 1 in the morning right now, PT time, and 1 in the afternoon to kind of like preserve our collective sanity in times of COVID, and to do 3 things. First is to create community for people that are isolating around the globe. Second one is kind of like to flag projects in the community that are doing really fantastic work and that are in need of help. And the third one is to kind of take COVID-19 as an opportunity to think about long-term ambitious change. And so today, I think we really, can do all 3 of them, but mostly I think really on the latter and thinking about the long-term future. And I will post a few a little bit of information about the salon in the chat, so I don't have to repeat myself. Basically, everything can be found on the Sanity schedule, which is the first link that I posted. If you're interested in hosting a salon, you can apply there. If you're interested in adding the salon to your Google Calendar, you can do that. If you're interested in watching the videos, we're uploading those 2 videos a day to our YouTube channel. You can do all of that there. And if you want to stay generally kind of up to date on our events, there's also a link for that. But now I am so thrilled to have Anders here again. He really is, I think, one of my favorite thinkers. And it's just this incredible infectious optimism that you comport yourself with is really admirable. And I think gives me a lot of hope for the future, because it's not a naive optimism, but it's a really deep thought, kind of like very very diverse and quite nuanced kind of way of thinking that still leads you to come to quite positive conclusions. So I'm really thrilled to have you here. And I think one thing that we're going to be discussing today is kind of like how well the long-term future can inform our thinking for today. You have been a fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute for quite some time. You're also a research associate for the Institute of Future Studies in Stockholm. You have a background in computational neuroscience, but really for the last 20 years, you've been, there are very few topics that you've left untouched in your writing. And I just went on your FHI profile, and there's a list of 49 publications. And I'm going to try to piecemeal-wise post them in the chat, so that when we get to the AMA, people have like a kind of like a basic for like all the different topics that they could be asking you about. So I think what I would love to do is maybe start on COVID-19 and implications for the long-term future, but just for a bit and not rest there for very long, because you've written a fantastic book on grand futures as well. So I would love to talk about that too. And then really about any topic from cryonics to mind uploading to AI to Fermi's problem and to kind of like long-term space races. I think we can really go as far as people want today. And so I'll be posting the list of publications in just a second, but for now I'm just really happy to have you here. I think one thing that was really very interesting to me, maybe as an introductory question, is that the salon, or like the topic that you proposed, is kind of like how can the long-term future inform our thinking or our actions today? And it stands in a really interesting contrast with the topic of the salon, which is how, or one of the topics, which is how can the current crisis inform, like a long-term change. So it's almost like the reverse of that. So I was really interested in seeing what do you mean by that, and how do you think can our kind of like thinking about the long-term affect our actions about COVID in particular right now, if at all?
Yeah, so thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. I think the important part here is the length of the future, the size of the future, the depth of the future, so to say, matters quite a bit for what you aim for. If you think that the future is going to be roughly meh, same old, and it's not terribly long, in that case, maybe saving the world is not that of a burning priority. There might be other things that we really need to do. If you take an extreme long-termist view, saying that, oh, most of the value resides really far away in the future, in that case, since we are here at the start, if we foul things up badly that have long-term consequences, then that's very bad. So we really need to work very carefully, ensuring that there is a long future. There are also aspects of, if you think the future, for example, is going to be very rich, in that case, there might be some problems we might leave to future generations to fix, because they will have resources, they will have the knowledge to do it. But there might also be things we can do to help that happen. So in short, the kind of future you think is likely, or even the possible scenarios for future, they should affect what you do. So I'm thinking about that sometimes when I get my salary and think, what should I do with the money? And well, there is the boring future, I should put it into my pension fund. And then there is the exciting thing, oh, maybe the singularity is not too far away, I should probably invest it so it gets useful there. And maybe doom and gloom is around the corner, maybe I should buy a prepping. You want to hedge a bit across the different futures.
And how has your thinking about the long-term future updated since, the current COVID-19 crisis, if at all? Are you more in the pension category now, or are you more in the all-out, let's go?
Well, the funny thing is, of course, I had enough prepping done because of Brexit anyway. So the main thing was I realized I need to bring the books over from the office. So I have big piles of books around my living room right now, so I can work on actually writing my own book. The fun thing about COVID is that this is not a surprise. This is something we all more or less saw coming. There are textbooks from 2009 pointing out that, look, there is going to be a coronavirus epidemic coming from those wet markets in China. It's kind of obvious, it's just a matter of time. That was a microbiology textbook. We kind of knew this. It was just a matter of time. Nobody knew when it would happen or exactly how bad it would be, but one can plan ahead for it. Then, of course, now we're seeing that any plan doesn't survive contact with the enemy. There is a lot of improvisation happening, but we can learn from that too. So in many ways, I think this is a dress rehearsal for something really serious. So we should be making the most out of it, actually.
Yeah, so you're thinking the Brexit was the flu for COVID, which is the flu in terms of global catastrophic risk for the actual risk that we have to prep ourselves against. But I think one thing that I saw, one thing that I saw on your Twitter was that, and one thing that the salon rests on that is this kind of like a quote by Milton Friedman that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when the crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around, right? So one of the kind of premises of the salon is like, maybe we can now come up with those ideas. But what you said in your Twitter post recently is that actually there were a few plans that were on the shelf for how to handle pandemics, but they're still on the shelves. They just weren't executed. So how do you think that, you know, even if we could come up with any kind of like theory of change right now, how do you make it more likely that actually next time around we are better prepared, or those preparations are actually being taken into account?
A lot of it is going to depend on getting those experiences, documenting them, and then working rather hard on getting them into the right corners. So those playbooks, for example, that the National Security Council had for an outbreak of an epidemic very much like the current one, they were left on the shelf because of the political realities of Washington being what they are. Their counterparts to them on other bookshelves in other governments that were used, sometimes not well. This is where we should be documenting it and making sure that after things calm down, we don't let people forget about who did the right thing and what failed. And maybe we who like to write this kind of plans should also figure out better ways of making sure that we can be remembered. I'm, for example, involved with AllFed, which is a non-profit working on kind of alternative food security in case of global agricultural disasters. And we have a whole bunch of wonderful ideas. It's just that this experience with those playbooks being left on the shelf indicates we need to rethink on how we put it out there, who to tell, how to make sure it's well known that there is documentation and ideas for this. So I think the real story here is we should be learning from the current experience, see what goes wrong, make sure we do something different next time. And we should also see what is going really well, and then point that out to people, making sure that it's kind of common knowledge that this actually worked fairly well because of these reasons.
All right, I just posted the Alfred that Dave Enkenberger did with Foresight in the group chat if people want to check that out. But what do you think is working particularly well and what is not working particularly well? So what, can we already make a point of pointing out later?
So one of the things that really surprised me was that self-isolation actually has worked out the way it has. By no means perfectly, but a large chunk of people started self-isolating very successfully. And that's partially because of new technologies. 10 years ago, we couldn't have done this very well. The video conferencing was not as well developed at all. We didn't have that much bandwidth. We didn't have that much experience with it. Most jobs would have been less virtual. It would have been hard to do. And we couldn't actually order that much stuff to our homes. It would have been much harder to do a proper isolation. 20 years ago, it would have been almost impossible. And certainly in many other countries and with certain jobs, you still can't do this. So this is a matter where technology has really moved forward, and we can probably analyze this and see, can we make use of these experiences to make even more resilient? It might be that in the case of disaster, we now need Walmart and Amazon. We actually should regard them as quite important part of the disaster mitigation strategy. When it comes to stuff, sorry.
No, go for it.
Yeah. So when it comes to things that have not worked out really well, I think the most striking thing to me was how China totally dropped the ball the first few weeks. After Beijing realized what was going on, they went in with typical ruthless efficiency and did stuff. But before that, basically the system that was supposed to alert the authorities that there is an emerging situation, which was instituted because of the SARS epidemic, that had been set up, but various local officials didn't want to lose face, didn't want to look bad. So they kind of decided, no, let's downplay this, let's not talk about it. Eventually the leaks became big enough that they got to hear about it and started moving. And this is, of course, a typical failure mode for authoritarian hierarchical systems. The Discordians called it the snafu principle. You can't really communicate if you're afraid of your boss. If your career depends on your boss liking you, you're not going to tell your boss stuff he doesn't want to hear, which means that he doesn't get to hear the information that is problematic, but he maybe should hear. This is where democracies have a real advantage, except that there is a lot more noise. But at least the information flow is better. The problem for democracy might be in the response the part. The problem is responding well, that's one thing, but you need to respond early against something that is going up exponentially. And this is where we saw that many of our authoritarian systems and systems that hide or make it hard to access information, they're in real trouble.
Yeah, we had one salon on that with Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation, where he was making a similar point, and a similar one yesterday as well, where I think Christine was pointing out that it seems like the US has like the worst of both worlds a little bit currently in what we're stuck. But I think what is actually really hopeful, like hope and dicing to me, is that you see so much effort right now. Like my Facebook feed is filled with COVID projects, especially I think many people in the biotech sector are really stepping in right now and are just kind of like are taking it in their own hands and really producing change. So I think that is something I think that should be supported much more. All right, so if you like, we had, I think the first salon that we kicked this series off with was Jan Tallinn on opportunities for addressing global catastrophic risk and existential risk that are arising from COVID-19. And I was wondering whether you see like anything in particular, you know, that is exciting, like any kind of like large scale efforts that we could be pushing for now, where our attention is a little bit like, where even, let's say, the mainstream's attention is a little bit more on that focus on the long-term future.
So right now, I think the science part of COVID is doing really well. If you just look at what has been accomplished in 3 months' time, it's beautiful. You have a large part of the scientific community focusing on various aspects, building models, sequencing, running simulations, all sorts of stuff. Yes, it's noisy, it's messy, etc. It's not peer-reviewed yet. But the progress is going really fast on the science part. It's just that we want it probably to go much faster. So developing better pipelines for the next event like this, so we can actually go from a new pathogen over sequence, protein structure, to developing various interventions against it, testing them out, distributing them quickly. Building that kind of pipeline and constructing the tools for that seems to be super valuable. It also really shows the benefit of doing this kind of global data sharing. So I'm very proud of knowing Max Roser at Our World in Data, because he's been doing this amazing job over the past few weeks of just trying to get all the data together, making it easily visualized, and trying to bring it out to decision makers, including calling out journalists and the government web pages when they're misrepresenting data or making a foolish mistake that affects policy. And I think this is the first kind of really big data epidemic where we're actually be able to gather an enormous amount of data and try to disseminate it in order to guide the policy. That doesn't necessarily mean we know how to do the policy right. One of the things that is happening right now is that basically every country is trying their own approach, and some of them are going to turn out to be wrong, some of them are going to be good, and we don't quite know which one is right. So we need to document and learn from this. But long term, if we extrapolate this, I think We want to develop a global disease surveillance system that is hard to fake, that doesn't allow local officials who want to save face to block progress, but actually makes it clear that something is emerging, and then makes it very quick to develop, if not a vaccine, at least maybe prophylaxis, if we could manufacture antibodies using protein engineering or nanotechnology, for example. Similarly, we want to have data pipelines that make it very easy to get data, and then combine that with various forms of forecasting. I was amazed when the research scholars at our institute started putting together not just an epidemiology model, took one off the shelf, but plugged it together with our local super forecasting team. So instead of just basing this on the official data, they had super forecasters making estimates of what the actual numbers were. After all, there might be a lot of non-reported cases, and then using that to make better estimates of different policy options. An early version of that website even had this interesting site where if you were planning a conference or an event, you could put in some data and it would suggest what the effects of holding that event would be. Now, that was dropped because quite quickly it became clear that nobody should be holding any event over the next few weeks anyway. But it feels like that tool, I want to have it around later on.
Yeah, that's a really nice practical one. All right, just to kind of like introduce maybe like your other type of thinking, and to encourage people to get their questions ready for the AMA and to raise their hand if they have any. You know, you wrote this, or you are authoring this really fantastic book on grand futures, and I had like the privilege of talking to you a little bit about that. I think it was last year sometime, and you know, just to kind of like give people here like a sneak peek into really how far you're thinking with this book. Could you maybe kind of like elaborate on the premise of the book that you're currently writing, and kind of like the types of futures that you're discussing in there?
So I call this grand futures. The term was coined by Toby Ord to denote this field of study of if we survive and get our act together, however that is going to happen, or whatever getting our act together actually means, then what? How big is the future? So I start out by looking at things like, okay, how much material and energy post-scarcity can we achieve according to known laws of physics? What about sustainability? How long can we live on Earth in a sustainable way? Can we do something to expand the habitability of Earth very far in the future, literally in 1 billion years? Well, what about going post-human in various ways? What about settling the solar system? Where are the limits there? What about settling the galaxy? What about settling intergalactic space? And then, of course, questions like, well, where is the universe going, and can we do something about that? How much mass, energy, information, and other things could we gather? And then, of course, what do different value theories say that we should be doing with it? So I'm trying to review all of this. Slightly unsurprisingly, it's becoming a rather thick book. The current page count of the manuscript is something like 1,050 pages. I'm kind of trying to squeeze it down to 800 pages, but I'm not done yet. And it goes very far in the future. I was literally having an argument online a bit earlier today about whether matter, if proton decay doesn't happen, will matter actually turn into iron, as Freeman Dyson suggested in his classic paper in 1979, or is it actually going to get stuck on a mixture of various heavy elements? So I was trying to solve some of the nuclear physics questions. This is totally beside the point, of course, because we're not going to be getting there most likely, because we have proton decay to deal with. But I wanted to figure it out. And the cool thing is, we can say things about the extreme far future based on currently known physics. We can actually analyze the question about where even stable isotopes are going to do if you leave them alone long enough. Then, of course, that might not be very action relevant, but it's a darn fun question.
It is a darn fun question. And, you know, given, like, I guess, like the current situation, has your kind of like a consideration of different types of scenarios changed since then? Do you think we're closer, or do you think we're further away from that future?
I think we're still kind of on track. Let's face it, COVID might lead to a lot of effects in the world. it's probably slowing down some areas of science, especially the lab sciences that are shut down because we're not COVID related. But some of the machine learning people, they're working as normal from home. The cloud is everywhere. So I think this is a relatively minor thing. What mostly has affected me is now I'm sitting surrounded by books, and I'm starting to realize how much more I need to read to integrate it with all the earlier work. Because I don't think what I'm doing here is super creative. I'm trying to show that there is a lot of stuff we already know as a civilization about likely and the possible long-term futures. There are ways of rigorously reasoning about it. But most people think that, no, you can't say anything about the far future. It's just made up stuff. I want to show that, no, actually, we can say quite a lot of solid things.
All right. And Rachel, you posted a question in the chat. Do you want to ask it in person?
Sure. So the question was, what are the most important top 3 things that humanity can do right now to increase our chances of getting to this grand future, where you can replace 3 with 2 or 5 or your favorite number under 10?
Yes, that's a great question. So the obvious, fairly boring one is, of course, well, we better survive. So we better learn how to avoid serious pandemics by this lesson. We need to figure out a way of reducing the risk of nuclear war. We need to get AI safety up and running by the point we have powerful AI, etc. That's kind of obvious, slightly boring answer. Then the second answer is, well, we probably need various forms of coordination. So some of you have probably seen that diagram that is in Nick Bostrom's book on superintelligence. He has this asteroid field with a little spacecraft that's humanity trying to get through it. And there are 3 coordinate accesses. One is technology, one is insight, and one is coordination. And it's rather important that we get all 3 in the right combinations to navigate the right way. And coordination is an interesting one, because the big problem we have right now with COVID that we're seeing in governance is, yeah, sometimes we don't coordinate as well as we could. The good news is we're coordinating way better than we would have a century ago, and even better than a millennium ago, because we have mass communication, we have international institutions, we even have various ways of setting up incentive structures that are better. We have invented things like Kickstarter. And I think future historians are going to say, oh, Kickstarter, well, that was an important turning point in making people's aggregating preferences and making stuff done. We have just started inventing tools like this. And this is, of course, our human superpower. Besides the language and a bit of intelligence, we can coordinate well. We can form group intentions, decide before going out on a hunt, not just that we are going to a hunt, but the strategy we're going to use and how we're going to divide the spoils, if there are any, so we don't get into a quarrel. Now, that is already a reason we're kind of running the planet for good and ill, and we can get better at that. So we can then coordinate about the things that need to be coordinated. The third part, the inside part, is of course the tricky one, because that's going to be full of surprises. But coordination and the safety.
All right, and then that's related to a question that Jeremy Hadfield just asked in the chat about specific tools that are more likely after COVID. Jeremy, do you want to ask the question yourself? You are muted, dear Jeremy.
There we go. Yeah, so I'm a student at Dartmouth, and we just started the online term today, where all classes are online. Many of them are asynchronous, where lectures will just post on YouTube, for example. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how that will induce social changes, especially in educational systems? So, for example, how will our perspective on mass collaboration and education change potentially? And do you see that as a positive thing or a negative thing?
Yeah, I think this is going to be an important kick in the behind for a lot of universities. We have, of course, all been talking about doing virtual lecturing for ages. I remember sitting in a video link-based lecture somewhere in the mid-90s, and basically the entire course, which was ironical about telecommunications, was mostly about fixing the video link because it didn't work at all. And this is, of course, why most of us don't normally use video links and video conferencing that much, because it's kind of tricky. And if you can avoid it, you do it the traditional ways. Now we're getting forced to do it, which means that people have to solve the annoying problems that exist. We have to invent things. And also some people are just going to invent things for the sheer heck of it, because it's cool, because we get a good idea in the shower, etc. So I think this is going to be actually the chance of getting somewhere. And universities are, of course, really, really ripe for disruption. Sitting here in Oxford, where we have been doing the same thing for about 800 years, well, maybe it's time to try to do education in slightly different ways. At least we can try it. Now, the cool thing is people are going to be doing a lot of experimentation because we're forced to. And some of that is going to stick. And I think that is going to set new ideas about how to do things, quality, etc. So I do think this is going to be super disruptive for universities, which is a kind of a good thing, actually. Incidentally, I got told a wonderful story by a friend who is in the South Bay. So his kid is in Milpitas, which is not the most well-off school, but they had this on the program of trying to do remote study. And they were kind of setting it up because of various reasons. And then COVID hit. And it was just plug and play. They had already tested it out for some of the students, and now we could just scale it up for the whole school. All the other schools around the area were totally unprepared, even in the much more in the upscale neighborhoods. And it's probably going to take a while. And those experiences people are getting now are going to be very valuable. We need to kind of take them, look at what's good, what didn't work out, try to scale up the good things, spread the best practice. And that's super valuable. So in many ways, we're kind of the first generation here. We have a chance of actually doing something very clever.
Yeah, that's super exciting.
Right, and that relates vaguely also to Jaja's question. Do you want to go for it in person?
Yeah. I actually have two questions. And the first one is, how does your perception of grand future different from what was proposed in the book A Limit to Growth? Because I read it a few years ago, and I feel quite disillusioned because of the scenario it proposed, and it seems more and more likely that we're hitting more and more crisis, and that will slow down the economy and eventually would drag down the margin the very same margin that we have for innovation. And my question is, what do you perceive as a critical change that already happened that might lead us to a more positive future, and what needs to happen?
Solar power. So the Limits to Growth book is interesting because it was not thinking that much about technological change. And insofar it was thinking, it was kind of assuming it's beside the point, and the good life doesn't center around anything technological. So it's more about, well, if we can move to some sustainable small-scale society, that's fine. And indeed, a lot of people think this is a really good goal to go for. I actually discuss this in the book because quite a lot of people really hate grand futures. They want modest futures or humble futures. I think actually if you took a poll worldwide, you will probably find that there's only a minority that want my grand futures, which might actually be totally fine, to each their own. And indeed, I think it's actually quite compatible to have humble futures while somebody goes off to space and move galaxies around, while others are playing cricket and drinking the tea at the village green, thank you, just normal. Now, what enables things like that? Well, the Limits to Growth book was arguing, well, we are just going to have an environmental problem and resource scarcity, they're going to force us there. And I think that is wrong, because while there are some people who certainly want to live a simple life, very few people want to be forced to be living the simple life, and they're going to try to find ways around. Now, the core question to getting to post-scarcity is you want energy sources that can be scaled up quite a bit and are very sustainable. And actually the exponential advances in solar power are a very cheering thing there. You can't run everything on solar power, but that, as well as atomically precise manufacturing, I think together can actually give you a very sustainable post-scarcity society. How you choose to organize that is very different. The real problem that we have is, of course, can we meet the different kinds of crises? Because One thing is resource crisis, which are limiting us. Another thing is the powers of the technology we have, the kind of crisis they give. Like we right now have an internet-based crisis of democracy and social organization. We don't know how to organize ourselves in this world, and we need to handle polarization and fake news of new kind. We have other risks coming from AI and of various kinds. These ones are in some sense the positive risks, that the technology allows us to do stuff that's dangerous or too powerful. The negative risk, when we can't handle various risks, I think we can actually overcome quite well. Now, the really tricky thing is many of the most important risks are value risks. They're risks to your style of life. And many people say, oh, it's horrible to live in the big city. I want to live in a small, nice village. But if we all move from the big cities to the small, nice village, the earth is going to be covered with suburbs. Actually, the big city is kind of, from a sustainability perspective, really awesome if you organize it well, while having a lot of little villages is super inefficient from a material standpoint. But some people might say, actually, I don't care too much about that because the value of a small village is so high to me. Others would say, no, there are other higher values we should go. And handling value disagreement is going to be a really important problem. So in the end, there are limits to growth set by the laws of physics, but they're so wide that they're almost beside the point. There are limits to growth set by current technology, which is also a problem, but that can be overcome. The question is, can we overcome it fast enough to avoid various crunches? Right now, we want to overcome the limit to vaccine production for COVID before our economy and the society frays too much. And that's something we might want to find ways of improving the speed of.
Yeah, very nice. I just posted a future forecast, which was, I think, from 30 years ago or something, with, I think, Eric Drexler, Mark Miller, Max Moore, and a few others predicting on kind of like the arrival of human brain emulation, automatic manufacturing, and so on and so forth. And those predictions are quite, let's say, optimistic, including like a kind of like $1 billion industry for cryonics and so on. At this point, I was wondering, what is your kind of like your arrival prediction for molecular nanotechnology, and then Creon, you're up next with your question. Just because you mentioned it, I'm curious because it's one of Foresight's kind of like focus.
Oh yeah, so I think I'm actually fairly bullish on nanotechnology. The reason is that the normal nanosciences community has kind of been stuck for various sad sociological reasons, working on stuff that is interesting science, but not really any technology that you can use to build stuff, which is, of course, Eric Drexler's original vision. And it's very important to move towards actual engineering rather than, wouldn't it be lovely? But first we need to totally understand these things. That's a bit like saying we can't build a steam engine until we've fully worked out all the aspects of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. Actually, it's the other way around. When we build steam engines, we start to figure out what matters and what doesn't matter. So I think we're going to see this pathway for protein engineering rather than the more hard, dry nanotechnology. And that one, I think, is going to come faster, partially supported by AI. I'm still not going to put a date on it, but I think it's going to be faster than many of us here think.
Oh, wow. That's great to hear. Yes, we've definitely, I think, at least amongst in Foresight circles, we've seen kind of like a, let's say, like somewhat like a more slowing, but then when Stoddard actually got the Nobel Prize in 2016, for the design and synthesis of molecular machines, I think since then, that whole theory or that whole kind of like research area has been kind of like seeing a major spike, and now we're doing actually, I think it's now our third technical competition with him as a co-chair that is specifically focused on molecular machines, and it's incredible the research that has recently come out in that area too. Okay, so with that, I want to give the word to Creon. If you want to say, actually you've already introduced yourself, but just remind us who you are and where you are, and what's your background and what's your question.
Hi, I'm Creon. I'm in Palm Springs, California right now, and I'm a applied physicist working in aerospace and certain other fields. And my question is, okay, Anders, you raised a couple of you edged in on this question. I'm going to want to maybe just try and get some thoughts or predictions or musings from you about the following, which is the implications of this crisis and any potential progress and change we make inspired by the crisis on other problems. Okay, you alluded to this with your 3 axes of innovation, technology, and coordination. You got into this a little bit with your making progress on value questions. But I'm wondering what you think about how this crisis can be leveraged for things that are not just like controlling pandemics, like everyone's already thinking about controlling pandemics and beefing up our healthcare system and all this obvious stuff. You tend to think more broadly about implications in a longer term and wider areas of human endeavor. So I'd like you to riff on that for a while, if you would.
So this ties in very nicely with the university question, I think. Because right now, a lot of things are up in the air and we're free to reinvent stuff. Many people are using self-isolation to actually change habits or build habits or just try out weird things. Apparently there is an endless amount of YouTube videos people are downloading to learn new little weird skills, whether that is whistling or baking. There was no yeast to be found in the local stores here in North Oxford because everybody's at home baking bread right now. Now, that's not just true on the individual level. This means that a lot of people actually can rethink stuff. In many ways, this fluid moment is quite open to suggest new institutions. And I think we might want to deliberately suggest to people that, look, in this area, maybe something COVID-like might happen. What do we do to make sure this area works well? So in the AI world, for example, everything is as normal because people are always in front of a computer connected to the cloud anyway. So that's no problem. Many people in the biosciences who were not working on something that could be repurposed to COVID, they're locked out of the lab. They have to actually read stuff. They have to think about it. And suddenly we might say, maybe remote lab work would be a very, very useful thing to have. It might also be, of course, very useful to figure out ways of avoiding the dark side of remote lab work, because I can see a lot of scary applications of that. So I do think we have a lot of cool chances here. And I think we should just take our own favorite domain that we're kind of mildly annoyed at and say, okay, if we get to reinvent this, can we do a reinvention and can I hitch this on this moment of fluidity? Especially the moment when we're actually coming out of our isolation. That's going to be a very weird situation. A lot of people are going to feel very emotional coming back to their office after weeks or maybe months. That's also a great opportunity to say, maybe we should do this totally differently. After all, we have been able to do this differently for a few weeks. So maybe we can do even more.
Yeah, I was already planning with a few people, like it would be really time to have like a really big international holiday. You know, like, I mean, it will hardly be likely that there's like one cutoff day where everyone's throwing their mask away and it's like, yeah, YOLO. But at least, you know, this is a really good opportunity. You know, I think like oftentimes prizes and national holidays are always used as kind of 2 tools to incentivize people to kind of like celebrate something long-term future related, right? Or to like spawn innovation there. And I think actually this is the first kind of thing that we're all really facing where no one is totally isolated from facing COVID-19. So I think, you know, picking an artificial constructed a date in future time where we can like make it an international holiday and kind of like create a positive memory around this would be really nice. You know, there will be a lot of competitions between countries to do it well.
It is an inexact analogy, but I've thought about Armistice Day from World War I.
Yeah, it's worth noting this is a shared experience. I've been kind of concerned over the past few years about the problem that we're living in this very diverse, pluralistic society that is kind of hard to get everybody together. We do no longer watch the same television programs or read the same newspaper. So it felt very atomistic. This, despite all the trouble it causes, despite all the tragedy, but also partially because it is such an important thing that you cannot avoid, means that we have a shared experience. That's worth treasuring.
it's in
never
itself
again.
almost a coordination device. Yeah. All right. And you just mentioned the kind of like a work from home labs. And I think to that, Donnie had a question on bioterrorism. Donnie, do you want to go?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Donnie. I'm holed up in Berkeley. My question is, will this pandemic make it more likely or less likely from here on out that bioterrorists will successfully engineer a super pandemic in the future?
I don't think it's going to change the traditional risk from bioterrorists. I think it's going to change the role of biohacking, and I think it's going to change the access to a lot of biomedical interventions. So long term, it's going to probably change things a fair bit. Because right now what is happening is that people are clamoring for the right to try laws. People are clamoring for experimental antibodies and vaccines and medications. Quite a lot of people are doing very stupid things. But it's also very real that if I can 3D print masks, maybe I have a moral duty to do it. Yes, they're not going to be as good as the ones that are normally sold, but it seems like given the shortage, maybe I should do it anyway. I think this is going to be the moment where a lot of makers, a lot of biohackers, a lot of small-scale bio startup that are pivoting and trying to fulfill some societal need are going to get much more free rein. That doesn't mean that the bioterrorists are getting a lot of useful tools, but it's probably going to make it more accessible, biotechnology, medical technology for others, for good and ill. I personally think we have kind of overregulated medicine a fair bit, but we have done that because when you do something stupid in medicine, people get hurt and die. So there is this balance of risk aversion versus risk taking. And I've generally been thinking that we're too risk averse. We need to readjust, and I think we're going to go in the right direction. But the real risk from bioterrorists is not so much the crazy loner in their home lab. It's the slightly larger crazy group, or the biotech startup cutting the corners about something that could be important in agriculture when doing something terrifyingly stupid with it. Or indeed on a nation state thinking that we can't really get hold of any plutonium, but we need a doomsday weapon anyway. Can't we put together something nasty in the lab and threaten everybody with dropping our test tube about that? That tale is where I think most of the bulk of the risk exists. So more home labs, they're not dangerous in themselves, but you're going to get more people who are used to making these technologies.
Anders?
Yeah.
On that, can you comment on the fact that it seems overwhelmingly likely that we're about to pump hundreds of billions of dollars into biosecurity of various sorts to prevent the next time this happens, and whether that has an impact?
That could definitely have a good impact, assuming, of course, it's not just, so much money that the actual biosecurity world can't digest it, and you get a lot of opportunists jumping in and selling snake oil. I mean, $100 billion is so much money that, of course, everybody is going to try to grab some of it. And there is a real risk that if you don't handle that well, we end up with not just security theater in the airport, but also kind of biosecurity theater. We might indeed end up with a lot of stuff that doesn't work, but quickly get entrenched interests who are going to defend very loudly to the decision makers that this is absolutely essential for national biosecurity, and anybody saying that this is snake oil is obviously working for the terrorists. So I see a real risk that it could be too much too quickly in too much of a panic. So this might actually be an important point in trying to shape it, trying to get critical thinking into it and make sure we actually get the right kind of good kind of biosecurity going.
All right. I think we just had a comment from Creon that maybe the national holiday that we can hereby implement should be named after the Chinese martyr doctor, Dr. Li. So maybe we can all go and coordinate around that a little bit. Yeah.
It's not a bad idea, because we need monuments, we need symbols. In 1918, some commenters noted that, wait a minute, just a few months ago, we had this horrible flu pandemic that killed a lot of people. People have forgotten it already. That was in 1918. So we need to actually, as soon as this is over and we hangover after the celebration is done, we need to raise more needs. And it might be a good thing to actually name it after Lee, because in many ways he represents what we need to do. We need to speak up early, even if it's inconvenient and troublesome. And yeah, it's always fun to annoy the Chinese Communist Party, of course, but I think it's also an important lesson. Sometimes we need our heroes.
I'd like to ask a question, Anders. Sorry to cut in like this, but you mentioned, of course, stuff about the online universities and this teaching of funny skills on YouTube or practical skills. I'm just wondering if you might riff on that a little bit more. We've had a lot of talk, before this crisis about how people should break away from social media, and social media is it's like runaway AI that's causing divisiveness and maximizing outrage. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, I think this is very important, particularly for Silicon Valley people who are basically software people, even if they're all pretending to be biologists right now, they're frankly not. And it's somewhat laughable. But anyway, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we might use this crisis and actually leverage some of the positive things that are happening online on the platforms that were so maligned before to make social media and related online technology a more beneficial tool for the world, like it was originally touted to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on where you are in the social media world. In my Twitter feed, it's right now totally dominated by COVID-19 and nuclear space propulsion. There are two communities that I seem to be involved in that are, basically the nuclear space propulsion people are the only ones who are not talking about the virus. They're instead talking about cooling and radioactive exhaust. And they haven't noticed probably that something is going on outside the window. And I think the thing is, we have seen some communities online that work really well. There are some social media that seem to be able to leverage that well, and there's some that probably just fail at doing it. Again, I think our job as individuals, as members of various groups and the public, is to try to grab hold of the things that work and try to point out to others, look, here is something that works, and try to figure out why did it work. It's a bit like noticing why certain things fail, like the hate fests on Tumblr, which are typically because you disagree with something somebody else posted. And the best way of responding is to repost it for your friends so they can also get very upset about it. And the medium itself leads to a particular kind of rage cascade. Now, knowing that doesn't mean that you can fix it, but sometimes noticing that something works really well means that you can replicate it.
All right. Yeah, I think one thing that you just mentioned, or wait, is there a question from someone else before I chime in? You're welcome to speak up if you have a question. Just shout it out.
Yes, I have one more question. I hope it's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, and say who you are and where you are.
I'm Jaja. I'm in North America right now. I'm actually in the US. My question is whether the policymakers currently taking advice from FHI or related research institute, and if so, what kind of advice that they're getting, and would you say that government officials and policymakers are more likely to take advice from people who have experience in long-term and already have plans? And if not, what kind of action that can be taken and or has been already starting to be taken right now to kind of make this long-term thinking more available to people with power?
I don't think we are giving that much straight advice to decision makers from FHI right now. The House of Commons here in Britain sent out a request to academics who might know useful things to kind of sign up on a list, and I think some of us are on that list. But they probably want to have people who know more about virology and epidemiology and very specific things. But still, this is the first time I actually seen that kind of request going out, because the traditional approach governments have is, of course, well, we have the scientific advisor and he or she can go out and ask other people and maybe have a list. You have the Swiss presidency that actually had a deliberately set up list of experts in a lot of different domains. In the case of a crisis, they could ask there. So if it's UFOs, there are some astronomers. If it's bioterrorism, there is a bunch of terrorism and biology experts. But these are pre-cached things. They are the people who are connected or well-known or got named for that list. Actually, having the real impact institutes like FHI and, or Our World in Data have is providing useful information that then doesn't go straight to the decision makers, but gets into the various other forms of organization. There are more specific things, of course, when it comes to biosecurity and other things, but I think the real long-termist impact is not going to be in a crisis. They don't really need that many philosophers for this. It might be good to have one or two philosophers, but if they're really good philosophers, they're mostly going to sound like you're not helping, even if they actually are. Nobody likes a philosopher when they're actually doing the job. If you like what a philosopher is saying, then yeah, he's kind of just lacing off. He's not doing proper philosophy. This is, of course, why they poisoned Socrates. But the thing long-termism can do is that you're part of intellectual discourse. You add this beforehand. Again, ideas that are picked up later. You want to have a long-termist ideas in the ethics conversations that are then recalled when the ethics committee are sitting in a crisis meeting about what do we do about our hospital right now.
All right, and maybe piggybacking. Jada, did you want to chime in? No?
Yes. So do you mean like philosopher are kind of like shaping the narrative of conversation, whereas like say people in like say Martin School or like more front line research are reaching policymaker like more easily in this crisis?
So many philosophers just like philosophy, so they like thinking and talking about it, and that unfortunately makes them fairly useless for everything. Then there are the philosophers who actually want to be useful. They're potentially dangerous because bad ideas kill, but sometimes they're good at clarifying things or pointing out errors in thinking or just doing things on a high level of abstraction. That's super valuable, but it's an acquired taste and it can be rather tricky. But then you have things like the Oxford Martin School. Now, the Martin School is interesting because James Martin donated a heck of a big pile of money to Oxford to set up this interdisciplinary system of research groups and institutes intended to solve the big problems of the 21st century. And he was probably mostly thinking that we should be doing research and being brilliant academics. We should be coming up with great solar panels and nanomachines and stem cells or whatever is needed. But where I think the school really got into its own was because of Ian Goldin, who was a former World Bank executive, part of the Davos crowd, and really well connected. And he wanted, of course, to bring his academics out to be policy relevant. We always got a pat on the head if we talk to decision makers. Not necessarily because we told them anything important, but we should be talking to decision. We should get into the habit of doing that. Far too much of academia is about impressing other academics. If I write a paper and it gets published in a high-ranking philosophy journal, that's great for my career. Unfortunately, it's only going to be read probably by a handful of philosophers. On the other hand, if I have a blog post that actually makes people make important decisions right, that might matter much more, but it's not going to look as brilliant on my CV. But what the Martin School got, because of its interest in policy relevance, was trying to train us to at least notice when we occasionally find this stuff that might be too important to just be sent to a nice journal. Maybe we need to write a white paper or actually ask some people who know how to network, can we actually get Whitehall to read this? Because it's kind of urgent.
All right, and a question that's related to that is, you know, we have so many folks on here that are, I think, you know, just starting their careers and are definitely interested in helping the long-term future. What would you kind of like advise them, you know, where should they throw their heart at if they really want to make a difference?
So I'm very fond of the effective altruism idea, again, this kind of free coordinate system about scale, tractability, and neglectedness. If you should be working on the biggest possible questions where you can make a dent. So the scale, again, this is a bit like the Singularity University thing. Can you change the life of 1 billion people? Working on a question that is not going to have a dramatic effect on the world, maybe you should find something that has a bigger effect. Of course, sometimes the small stuff is what has very, very big effect, and you might have enough foresight to notice that. After all, the band gap in the semiconductors is 1 electron volt. That's nothing. But because of that band gap, semiconductors allow us to build computers and the internet and solar panels and actually change the world. The second
And
thing... Sorry?
Well, I was just thinking in terms of effective altruism, how do you think that, you know, the focus on tractability and the focus on like large scale impact, because that does seem, especially with like, you know, hard science or with like long-term ethics, there's so much uncertainty that's sometimes problematic. And because you're thinking so long-term, how is that kind of like trade-off? How have you thought about that? And how have you kind of like reconciled that for you?
So if you only go for tractability, you will try to solve problems that you think are important, but you also think there is a way of solving. But typically that means that it's something a lot of other people are working on, which might be very worth working on if it's an important thing, like climate change or nanotechnology. But in many cases, of course, they're neglected, or people actually don't know how to solve the question. And generally, the impact there is doing the first stab at that research. That first paper, even considering the question and trying to see what happens, that is super powerful. Because quite often you go from 0 to at least some knowledge. And quite often that some knowledge is, there is nothing here. This is a boring problem, or it's actually messy, or there is nothing here. But you don't know that before trying. So you actually need to try a lot of different things. And I think this is where your personality as a young researcher comes in. So I'm one of those generalists. I'm not brilliant at any particular area, but I'm very happy to make a stab at any question. That means that I get through a lot of different little domains. Other people are kind of pyramid builders. They build the tools to make tools to build a really nice edifice of careful research that moves us towards a clear goal. And depending on your skills, you should be aiming at some mixture of these ones. Typically, as a generalist, you want to be good at least one thing so you get hired, as in some places. And ideally, it's kind of a general skill. In my case, it's mathematical modeling. If you're more focused, you still want to at least be a bit curious about what's going on the outside of your own field, because quite often you need to talk to people out there and they have interesting information you didn't know you needed. But then, of course, thinking strategically about this is also important. Quite a lot of the researchers just start without actually thinking, why am I even working on this? Typically, it's my advisor told me to. And why did he say that? Quite often it turns out that maybe he had an idea, or maybe his advisor told him something, or maybe it was the fashion at the time. A surprising amount of research is done for really bad reasons.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think, you know, we are already 6 minutes over time. I would just love, you know, maybe if we can stop like on a hopeful note, like what is the thing that kind of gives you hope day to day? What makes you so incredibly optimistic? Make us have some contact high from you.
Well, part of my optimism is probably just genetic. On my father's side, it's very notable that everybody is either very happy or very pessimistic, and I seem to be one of the happy ones. So that's the boring biological reasons. But I had this moment that maybe flipped me into the happy version of the Sandberg family. When I was sitting, it was the end of a school day. I was sitting on a bench outside my school. I was feeling sad about something. Then I realized, either I can do something about this, and then I should be doing that, or I can't do anything about it. And in neither of these cases, it matters if I'm feeling sad about it. And that moment, that was the start when I kind of started building myself up to be this kind of optimist. So certainly the world is full of tragedies, disasters, entropy, and just annoying things. But most of them, we can circumvent, we can do things better. We have been doing that. If we look empirically, I think this planet has improved quite a bit over the past 4 billion years. Even over the past century, the past 10 years, there have been a lot of improvement. None of that is guaranteed to continue. That's kind of up to us. But so far, so good. And given how surprising many of the improvements in the world have been, to, if you imagine a time travel from 10 years ago or 100 years or 1,000 years ago, that suggests that we have a lot of really cool surprises ahead of us. So I'm using induction to be optimistic.
It's a very nice, logical way to do it. I am posting a website now, Existential Hope, which is kind of like, it's not super up to date right now, but it's basically a website in which I'm trying to collect kind of like positive future visions to onboard the next generation to think in this like very kind of like long-term optimistic way about the future. If you have good readings that I think inspire hope and optimism for you for the future, please add them to it. With that being said, Anders, I cannot thank you enough for kind of like spicing up at least my morning, for many of you, your evening. I see a lot of smiles and a lot of happy faces, a lot of clapping. It was really, really, really wonderful to have you on. I'm hoping that we can have you on again, actually. I really like this. And because we barely even touched on anything on like one of the million topics that you've written about. So if people want to go out and check out Anders' publications, and if there's then demand for it, I would certainly love to have you back on. It's been really fantastic. And I'm posting a bit more information on how to join those salons and how to join our mailing list to stay up to date on these salons now. If you're interested in saving that, do it now, because I'm going to close off now. Thank you. Have a lovely day and evening, everyone. It's been wonderful. Bye-bye. See you all soon. Hopefully many of you tonight at 6, and if not, tomorrow again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.